Cover that face, Ireti. He is inside the house.
11 nights earlier, Ireti Akinola drew a cotton swab across a painted folding screen and uncovered the corner of a human eye. She stopped before the damp cotton could travel another millimeter. Under her magnifying lamp, the eye looked back through a veil of gray paint. Its iris was brown. Its upper lid carried the sure, unbroken curve of a master portraitist. This was not a crack, a stain, or a careless correction. Someone had painted a face beside Kwon Hae-won, then buried it beneath the elegant screen that had filled the right side of the portrait for almost 20 years. Outside the conservation room, autumn rain silvered the windows of the Kwon residence. Inside, every clock seemed to lose its sound. Ireti lowered the swab and studied the famous woman at the center of the canvas. Hae-won wore a modern ivory hanbok. One hand rested on a strip of indigo cloth. The other appeared to disappear behind the screen. Until that moment, the pose had looked formal. Now it looked interrupted, as though another person had once stood close enough to be touched. Ireti had been hired to remove smoke residue before the family's memorial rite, not to disturb the history of Seoul's most feared household. Her contract named the portrait as a private family object. It did not mention that Kwon Jae-hwan controlled a shipping empire by day and a quieter network after midnight. It did not mention the men who removed their shoes at his door, bowed without meeting his eyes, and left with their shoulders lower than when they entered. None of that changed the paint. She shifted the lamp and tested the edge of the gray layer under ultraviolet light. The old natural varnish glowed a cloudy green. The painted screen remained almost black. It was newer than the portrait, much newer. Whoever had hidden the face had done it after Hae-won's death, using a conservation resin that had not been available when the work was first completed. That meant the hidden woman had not disappeared by accident. She had been removed. The door opened without a knock. Kwon Jae-hwan entered in a black suit, darkened at the shoulders by rain. He was 40, lean rather than broad, with the stillness of a man accustomed to making other people reveal their intentions first. A thin scar crossed one knuckle. He wore no visible weapon. He did not need one. The guard in the corridor straightened before Jae-hwan had even looked at him. Ireti did not move away from the easel. She angled the lamp toward the eye. Jae-hwan's gaze reached the exposed curve and stopped. His right hand closed around the back of a wooden chair. The polished frame gave a small complaint beneath his fingers. For one breath, the man who could empty a boardroom by entering it looked like a son who had found an unfamiliar shadow beside his mother. Then the softness vanished. He crossed the room, dropped the protective cloth over the canvas, and turned Ireti's ultraviolet lamp toward the floor. Two guards appeared at the threshold. One reached for her open case. Ireti closed it first. She removed her gloves, laid them on the contract, and began packing each tool with exact care. Her brushes went into their roll. Her solvent bottles returned to their padded slots. She took the memory card from her camera and placed it beneath her tongue for 3 seconds while she locked the case, then slipped it into the seam of her sleeve. The gesture was small. Jae-hwan saw it. He extended one hand. Ireti lifted the contract instead. She tore her signature from the final page, set the strip of paper on the covered portrait, and carried her case toward the door. She had spent 16 years restoring what wealthy families preferred to display. She would not become another tool used to erase what they feared. Jae-hwan did not block her. That unsettled the guards more than anger would have. He stepped aside and watched her walk through the long corridor lined with pale stone and winter orchids. She reached the entrance hall before footsteps followed. Not the guards, only him. He placed the room key on top of her case. Beside it, he set his own phone, unlocked and recording. Then he turned the device off, removed the small lens mounted above the conservation room door, and laid that beside the key. His apology contained no lowered head and no softened expression. It was made of surrendered surveillance. Ireti stared at the 3 objects. The key offered access. The dead camera returned control. The phone admitted that he had been recording her. None erased the hand that had reached for her tools, yet none was an empty gesture. She carried the case back herself. By midnight, the guards had been moved to the far end of the corridor. Jae-hwan remained inside the room, seated against the wall where Ireti could see both his hands. She uncovered the portrait again, but did not touch the hidden face. First, she photographed the eye, mapped the loose paint, and sealed the test area under a square of Japanese tissue. Every step slowed the danger without stopping it. Jae-hwan watched her build order around the impossible discovery. The longer he sat there, the less he resembled the rumors attached to his name. He was not impatient. He never touched his mother's image. When a flake of ivory paint loosened near Hae-won's sleeve, his shoulders tightened, but he allowed Ireti to secure it before he came closer. At 2 in the morning, Ireti turned the portrait under raking light. A ridge appeared beneath the painted screen. It followed the outline of a cheek, then descended toward a shoulder. The hidden figure had not been a servant in the background. She had stood at Hae-won's side, almost level with her. More disturbing was the visible hand. Hae-won's fingers did not end behind the screen. Their raised contour continued beneath it, angled toward the buried woman's wrist. The public portrait showed a Korean matriarch standing alone. The first painting had shown her holding on to someone. Jae-hwan rose. He approached until his reflection hovered in the varnish beside his mother. Ireti expected him to cover the image again. Instead, he removed the heavy family ring from his right hand and placed it on the floor. Only then did he come within reach of the canvas. It was the first sign that the portrait belonged to a struggle larger than grief. The ring did not represent wealth. It represented the organization Hae-won had helped build, the one her son had inherited and never publicly questioned. Ireti turned her attention to the indigo cloth painted across Hae-won's lap. Tiny white marks formed broken circles inside darker rings. The pattern was not Korean. It resembled the storm eye motif her mother, Yetunde, had printed on cloth in Lagos for as long as Ireti could remember. She took a close photograph and sent it through an encrypted video call. The Lagos screen opened on late afternoon sunlight. Yetunde sat at a cutting table in her textile workshop, a tape measure around her neck and chalk on one thumb. Ireti held the image close to the camera. Her mother leaned forward. The color left her face before the connection could adjust. Yetunde's hand struck a metal tray. Spools rolled across the table. She covered the camera with her palm and ended the call. Ireti remained beside the glowing screen. Her mother had not asked where the cloth came from. She had not needed the portrait turned around. One fragment had been enough. Across the room, Jae-hwan had seen the reaction. He looked from Ireti to the covered eye. Suspicion returned to his posture, but it no longer pointed in one direction. Until that call, he had believed a stranger had arrived in his house and found a secret. Now it appeared that the secret had known her family first. Before dawn, a storm moved over Seoul. The residence lights dimmed, steadied, then dimmed again. A guard checked the corridor. Jae-hwan's phone showed a security map of the grounds. Every camera along the eastern wall failed in sequence, one after another, like candles pinched out by an unseen hand. Ireti smelled turpentine before the alarm sounded. It came through the air vent, sharp and wrong. Her own solvents were sealed. She crossed the room and pressed the emergency stop on the ventilation panel. Jae-hwan reached the door at the same moment. Smoke slipped under it in a thin white line. The guards outside moved, but the electronic lock held them in the corridor. Someone had sealed the conservation room from the central system. Ireti did not wait to be rescued. She pulled a fire blanket from the cabinet, soaked its lower edge in deionized water, and wrapped it around the portrait without letting the damp fabric touch the paint. Jae-hwan lifted the easel while she guided the frame free. The canvas was larger than either of them could carry alone. Their first act of trust was not tender. It was measured in weight, timing, and the few seconds before the smoke grew dense. A narrow service hatch opened into the old linen passage behind the wall. Ireti had noticed it during her initial condition survey. Jae-hwan had not. She drove the metal end of her torch beneath the latch and forced it upward. He lowered the portrait toward her instead of taking the opening first. She slid through, caught the lower frame, and pulled. He followed with one shoulder against the canvas, placing his own body between the painted surface and the stone edge. When the frame caught, a sharp corner cut through his sleeve. He did not look down. Ireti adjusted the blanket and freed the gilt molding before one more millimeter could splinter. They emerged in a dark storage hall as the locked room's fire suppression system released behind them. Water hammered the other side of the wall. Had the portrait remained on the easel, Hae-won's face and the hidden woman beneath the screen would have been stripped by pressure before the smoke ever reached them. The attack had not been designed to burn the house. It had been designed to make the destruction look accidental. Jae-hwan's security team broke through the outer door minutes later. He stood over the wrapped portrait, his damaged sleeve pressed against his arm, and examined each man's face. No one was dragged away. No order was spoken. He simply took the access cards from 3 senior guards, bent them between his fingers, and dropped the broken pieces into the water, spreading across the floor. The consequences traveled faster than shouting. Before sunrise, cars left the compound. Office lights ignited across the river. At the port, 3 night managers found their credentials canceled. The part of Jae-hwan's world that lived after midnight had begun moving, but it moved without spectacle. Ireti saw what power looked like when it did not need to announce itself. She also saw the choice he made next. He placed the portrait in the back of his armored car, then handed her the only key. He sat in the passenger seat while she chose where it would go. Her studio was no longer safe. The mansion had already been entered from within. Ireti studied the rain streaming down the windows, then pointed to the address printed inside the portrait's old transport frame. It belonged to Hae-won's abandoned fashion atelier in Iljiro, a building Jae-hwan had kept locked since his mother died. His jaw hardened. The address clearly carried a pain that his house did not. Still, he signaled the driver towards Central Seoul. The atelier occupied the top floor of a narrow brick building between a lighting shop and a printer that opened before dawn. Dust lay over cutting tables. Bolts of silk stood inside cabinets like color trapped behind glass. A treadle machine waited beneath the window. On one wall, Korean rami samples hung beside Nigerian indigo cloth, their edges pinned together for a collection that had never reached production. Ireti stepped toward them, but her phone vibrated. A courier had arrived at her apartment with a package sent from Lagos before her mother ended the call. Jae-hwan's driver retrieved it without opening it and returned 40 minutes later. The wrapping was ordinary brown paper tied with red cotton thread. Ireti cut the thread with a conservation knife. Inside lay 2 narrow pieces of fabric. One was pale Korean rami, nearly transparent. The other was deep blue adir, marked with white circles. They had been stitched together by hand. Between the folded seams rested a dried curl of gray paint. Ireti placed the fragment beneath her portable microscope. Its pigments matched the painted screen covering the hidden face. The same modern resin bound its surface. Someone had given Yetunde a piece of the layer used to erase the woman in the portrait. At the bottom of the package lay a small brass cuff, broken cleanly through its center. Ireti had seen its other half only minutes earlier. It was painted around the hidden woman's wrist. Jae-hwan looked at the cuff, then at the portrait his mother had left behind. Ireti looked at the careful stitches joining Lagos indigo to Korean rami. Her mother had not merely recognized the cloth. She had known the woman beneath the paint, and somewhere between Seoul and Lagos, she'd been waiting 18 years for the face to return. Morning entered the atelier through high windows stained amber by the rising sun. Ireti placed the brass cuff beside the painted wrist and began removing the screen 1 square centimeter at a time. The work punished haste. The gray overpaint sat directly above fragile flesh tones. A solvent strong enough to dissolve the newer resin could soften the older cheek beneath it. Ireti tested gels in the margin, timed each contact, and lifted the residue with rolled cotton. Jae-hwan stayed on the other side of the room. He had exchanged his ruined jacket for a plain black shirt, but the torn sleeve remained loosely tied around his forearm. No guard entered unless Ireti opened the door. By noon, a brow emerged, then the bridge of a nose. The hidden woman's skin had been painted with umber, rose madder, and a small amount of blue in the shadows. The artist had understood black skin well enough to avoid flattening it into one dark color. Light moved across the face. Warmth lived along the temple. This woman had been observed closely and painted with respect. Ireti's hand began to tremble when the left cheek appeared. A narrow crescent ran beside the ear. It was not damage. It was a pale scar, the same small mark Yetunde carried from a childhood fall against her grandmother's iron stove. Ireti had touched that scar while sitting on her mother's lap. She had watched powder settle into it before weddings. She had seen it deepen when Yetunde laughed. The hidden woman was not someone her mother had known. It was her mother. Ireti set down the swab. Her stool rolled backward until it struck the cutting table. She stood with both hands braced against the wood, staring at a younger Ireti Akinola beside Korea's most powerful criminal matriarch. Her mother wore the brass cuff and a jacket made from Korean rami over a blue Yoruba wrapper. Hae-won's concealed fingers circled her wrist, not as an owner restraining a servant, but as one woman stopping another from walking away. Jae-hwan crossed half the room and stopped. His body leaned toward Ireti, while his feet remained planted beyond her working boundary. He did not reach for her. He folded a clean cloth, placed it beside her left hand, and lowered himself onto the floor. The distance gave her space without leaving her alone. Ireti pressed the cloth to her mouth. The linen darkened beneath her breath. For 36 years, Yetunde's connection to Seoul had been a closed door in their family. Ireti knew only that her mother had returned to Lagos before Ireti's birth, and later made a handful of business trips she never explained. She had assumed the silence belonged to disappointment or loneliness. The portrait gave it a different shape. It looked like survival. Jae-hwan's mother had also lived inside a silence. Family history described Hae-won as a gifted designer who abandoned fashion when the Kwon organization grew. It said she died from a sudden heart failure during a private dinner. Jae-hwan had spent the preceding years in military service and a shipping apprenticeship in Busan, deliberately kept away from the atelier. By the time he returned, Yetunde had been blamed for missing funds and removed from every company record. Within weeks, Hae-won's sister, Myung-suk, took control of the textile foundation, yet the atelier told another story. Nigerian cloth remained cataloged beside ramie and hanbok silk. 2 cutting stations faced the same window. The initials H and Y had been burned into the handles of matching shears. These women had planned a future together. Someone had not only erased Yetunde's face, they had erased the partnership itself. The elevator bell sounded downstairs. 3 black cars had stopped outside the narrow building. Kwon Myung-suk entered the atelier with 6 family elders and 1 conservator from her foundation. She was 63, silver-haired, straight-backed, and dressed in a charcoal durumagi over a severe modern suit. Jae-hwan resembled her around the eyes, but where his stillness held restraint, hers held calculation. Everyone bowed. Ireti did not mistake etiquette for submission. She returned the greeting with the measured respect she had learned during years in Seoul, then positioned herself between the visitors and the easel. Myung-suk inspected the uncovered half of Yetunde's face. Not one muscle in her own face moved. Her gaze traveled to the brass cuff on the table, rested there for a fraction too long, and shifted to Ireti. Recognition had passed through the room, quiet and complete. The foundation conservator opened a metal case and prepared to approach the canvas. Ireti lowered the magnifying lamp across his path. He stopped. One of the elders placed a chair for Myung-suk at the head of the cutting table and a smaller stool for Ireti near the service door. The placement reduced the black specialist who had recovered the face to hired hands in a family dispute. Jae-hwan lifted the small stool. He carried it past every elder and set it beside his own chair. Then he remained standing until Ireti sat. The gesture broke more than seating order. In a family built on rank, he had placed her professional authority beside his bloodline. Myung-suk's thumb pressed into the jade head of her walking cane. Two elders looked away. By evening, a photograph of the arrangement would reach every person deciding who controlled the Kwon ports. Myung-suk approached the portrait herself. Her bare hand rose toward the newly uncovered cheek. Ireti caught her wrist before her fingers could touch wet solvent. The guards in the hall moved as one. Jae-hwan did not. He looked at his aunt's captured hand, then at Ireti's steady grip. After a long breath, Myung-suk withdrew. She removed a white chrysanthemum from the memorial bundle carried by her assistant and laid it across the gray section still hiding half of Yetunde's mouth. The flower was meant for the dead. Ireti picked it up and placed it in a glass of clean water. Myung-suk left with the elders. The foundation conservator closed his case without using a single tool. Only after the elevator descended did Jae-hwan sit down. The broken alliance between nephew and aunt had become visible, and the memorial was 9 days away. That night, Ireti found a covered bowl beside her microscope. Jae-hwan had brought abalone porridge from the small restaurant his mother once used during late fittings. Next to it sat bean cakes and pepper sauce from a Nigerian kitchen in Itaewon. The combination was imperfect, but it showed effort without performance. He had not ordered a grand dinner. He had found the kind of food that allowed tired hands to keep working. Ireti ate at the cutting table. She left half the bean cake on the lid and pushed it toward him. Jae-hwan accepted it with both hands. The Korean courtesy precise even in an abandoned room at 2 a.m. When the pepper reached him, his eyes watered. He finished every bite. Later, he found one of Ireti's cotton gloves split at the wrist. He took a needle from his mother's machine and tried to repair it. His stitches leaned like frightened birds. Ireti watched from the easel until he finished. Then she removed the red thread from Yetunde's package, undid his uneven work, and re-stitched the glove with him, holding the fabric taut. Their hands never touched. The space between them grew charged anyway. Trust arrived in such small exchanges that neither could name the moment it became dangerous. The next layer answered one mystery and opened a worse one. Under magnification, Ireti found 2 different gray paints. The lower one was 18 years old. The upper glaze had been added only 3 years earlier. Someone had returned long after Hae-won's funeral and reinforced the erasure when aging varnish began to reveal the face. Jae-hwan traced the later resin through the family foundation's conservation invoices. The work had been authorized from Myung-suk's office on a night when the portrait was officially sealed inside the Kwon residence. The listed restorer had died months before the date on the record. A port security vehicle had entered the grounds for 47 minutes and left before dawn. The erased face was not merely an old crime. Someone was still maintaining it. Jae-hwan opened a steel cabinet at the back of the atelier. Inside, he found sample garments from Hae-won's unfinished collection. Each piece joined Nigerian indigo with Korean rami, but the labels had been cut away. The final coat carried 2 empty loops at its cuffs. They matched the width of the broken brass bracelet. Ireti placed Yetunde's half against one loop. It fitted. The cuffs had not been jewelry chosen for a portrait. They had been a mark of a business founded by both women. Hae-won had worn one half. Yetunde had worn the other. Myung-suk had turned their shared symbol into evidence of theft after Hae-won died, and Yetunde fled Korea. The foreign partner became the convenient betrayer. The Korean sister became the grieving custodian. A whole family had accepted the easier story because it protected its name. Ireti's phone lit with a silent video from Lagos. The camera showed Yetunde's textile cooperative in Yaba. Custom seals crossed the doors. Women who depended on the workshop stood outside with bolts of cloth, balanced beneath plastic against the rain. A dark vehicle waited across the street. Its plate belonged to a security company used by the Kwon shipping network. The threat had crossed continents before Ireti could finish uncovering her mother's mouth. Jae-hwan reached for his phone. Ireti placed her palm over it. She would not allow men with guns to descend on her mother's workshop and turn Lagos into an extension of his private war. She opened an airline schedule instead and selected the next flight. He studied her choice. Then he removed every security detail from the booking and reserved 2 ordinary seats under their own names. They left the portrait inside a humidity-controlled case at the atelier. Ireti sealed its doors with numbered conservation tape, known only to her. Jae-hwan assigned 1 guard, an older woman who had served Hae-won during the fashion years and whose access card had never touched the mansion's central system. 20 hours later, Lagos heat met them outside the airport like an opened oven. Jae-hwan had arrived without an entourage for the first time in his adult life. Traffic pressed close around the hired car. Hawkers moved between lanes with plantain chips, phone chargers, and cold water held above their heads. Ireti watched him resist the instinct to control a city that refused to move according to anyone's command. Yetunde's home stood behind the sealed workshop. Family members had gathered in the courtyard. Aunties in bright wrappers watched the Korean stranger step out beside Ireti. His tailored black coat, wrong for the heat, announced the distance he had traveled before his name could announce his power. Yetunde waited at the doorway. Ireti moved toward her. Yetunde did not open her arms. She checked the road first, then the windows, then Jae-hwan's empty hands. Her fear had survived long enough to become routine. Jae-hwan removed his shoes before crossing the threshold. He bowed with both hands visible, deeper than business required. Then he waited until Yetunde's eldest brother entered and greeted the older man before taking a seat. He did not reach for the chair placed at the head of the room. He chose the low stool beside Ireti. The family noticed. So did Yetunde. On the dining table, she arranged 3 porcelain cups, the broken brass cuff, a silver medicine case, and a jade ring. The jade carried Myung-suk's family crest. Yetunde placed 1 cup before an empty chair and another before herself. She moved the medicine case beside the empty cup. Then she used the jade ring to slide the cups past each other. Her fingers closed around her own throat. The empty chair tipped backward beneath her hand. The story required no voice. 18 years earlier, Yetunde had watched Myung-suk exchange Hae-won's medicine cup during a private dinner. Hae-won had collapsed before dessert. While the household rushed around her, Myung-suk had pressed the jade ring into spilled tea, leaving a pale scrape Yetunde could still reproduce on the porcelain she had carried away. Yetunde turned over the 3rd cup. A faint crescent of green marked its base. Jae-hwan leaned toward it, but his hand stopped above the table. His mother's death had always been explained as a failure of the heart. Now the surviving cup held the outline of a deliberate exchange and the memory of the only witness the family had discredited. Yetunde opened a small wooden box and removed Ireti's childhood school ribbon. She tied it around the jade ring, then placed both beside a newspaper clipping about a playground accident from Ireti's first year of school. No quotation was needed. Myung-suk's people had known where her daughter played. Silence had been the price of keeping Ireti alive. Ireti's face lowered. Her mother had not hidden Korea because she was ashamed of the life she had lived there. She had buried her closest friendship beneath ordinary motherhood, so the threat would have nothing left to follow. Jae-hwan took off his family ring, retrieved from the flooded conservation room, and placed it beside the jade one. Then he pushed it toward Yetunde. She returned it with 1 finger. Power could not pay for what power had taken. That evening, Yetunde packed Ireti's suitcase. She folded each dress, added her passport, and placed the bag beside the door. Ireti unpacked it. She returned every dress to the wardrobe, set her restoration gloves on top, and carried the empty case back to her room. Mother and daughter stood across the narrow hallway, neither willing to surrender the other to fear. Jae-hwan watched without interfering. Before sleeping, he spread a blanket on the sitting room floor rather than accept the guest room. It was not humility performed for approval. It was his refusal to occupy more space in a home already crowded by consequences bearing his family name. At dawn, news arrived that the Kwon-controlled terminal had impounded every container belonging to Yetunde's cooperative. Wages, school fees, and 12 small businesses were trapped behind one electronic hold. Releasing them through force would expose the workshop to more danger. Leaving them sealed would punish women who had never seen the portrait. Jae-hwan opened his laptop at the dining table. He transferred the Kwon network's controlling interest in the Lagos terminal to an independent logistics cooperative and authorized external compliance review. The concession had given him leverage across West Africa. It also controlled 2 votes he needed at his mother's memorial council. He signed it away. The customs seals were removed before noon. Workers rolled the workshop doors upward. Color returned to the street in armfuls of indigo. Yetunde stood among the women and watched Jae-hwan carry the first bolt from the loading area without asking anyone else to take its weight. When he returned inside, she lifted Hae-won's half of the brass cuff from beneath her sleeve. For 18 years, she had worn it against her skin. She joined it to the broken piece from the package. The fracture lines met so closely they almost disappeared. Then she placed the completed cuff in Jae-hwan's palms. It was not forgiveness. It was permission to finish what both mothers had started. Ireti and Jae-hwan flew back to Seoul that night. Neither touched the armrest between them, yet neither slept. The cuff rested in Ireti's case. Jae-hwan's family ring remained in his pocket, heavier now that he had chosen people over territory. When they reached Iljiro, the old guard sat outside the atelier with her access card broken beside her. She was conscious, wrapped in a coat, and furious at her own failure. The numbered seals on the door had been sliced with a blade. Inside, the cutting tables were bare. The humidity case was gone. The portrait was gone. Even the dust outline beneath it had been wiped clean. Only one object remained beneath the magnifying lamp. Myung-suk's white chrysanthemum had been pressed flat under Hae-won's silver thimble. The thimble was not a trophy. It was an invitation. Myung-suk wanted her nephew to return to the family residence, where every corridor belonged to her security system, and every elder could watch him choose between blood and truth. She had taken the portrait because its destruction in Iljiro would look like panic. Its destruction inside the Kwon house could be declared a private act of preservation. Ireti checked the tracking sensor embedded beneath the lower stretcher bar. It was a harmless humidity tag no larger than a grain of rice, installed during her first condition survey. Its signal pulsed from the east wing of the mansion, directly above the room where smoke had nearly destroyed the painting. Jae-hwan spread a floor plan across the cutting table. 3 routes entered the east wing. Everyone passed cameras controlled by men whose loyalty could no longer be measured. He marked an underground service tunnel. Ireti crossed it out. A single locked door could trap them below the house. She marked the old fabric lift she had used during the first attack. Jae-hwan crossed that out because the lift opened inside his mother's dressing room, the first place Myung-suk would guard. Their disagreement needed no raised voices. His pen protected her by reducing her role. Her pen restored her agency by putting her back beside the portrait. At last, Ireti drew one line through the wall of the original conservation room, following the narrow linen passage. She placed the brass cuff at its end. Jae-hwan looked at the line, then at her. He folded the plan according to her route. Before leaving, Ireti prepared the canvas for movement. She cut acid-free boards, packed a low-pressure suction device, and filled a small bottle with the gel that could remove the gray resin. Jae-hwan stood near his mother's sewing machine, turning the family ring Yetunde had returned in Lagos. The silver thimble beneath the funeral flower had delivered Myung-suk's invitation clearly enough. She still believed inherited power would bring him home. He placed the ring in the machine's metal drawer and closed it. For the first time since inheriting the Kwon organization, he walked into danger without its symbol on his hand. They reached the residence after midnight in an unmarked delivery van. Rain had stopped, leaving the stone courtyard bright beneath security lights. Jae-hwan wore the plain uniform of the household maintenance staff. Ireti carried a roll of Korean rami over one shoulder and hid her conservation case inside it. The disguise worked because powerful households trained themselves not to see people who carried tools. At the service entrance, an older cook recognized Jae-hwan. Her hand paused above the access panel. She had served Hae-won and remembered the night Yetunde vanished. Instead of pressing the alarm, she set a tray of persimmons in the doorway, blocking the camera for 4 seconds. Jae-hwan and Ireti crossed behind her. When the tray moved, the corridor was empty again. The mansion had changed in their absence. White memorial cloth covered the mirrors. Chrysanthemums filled the entrance hall. Hae-won's ancestral tablet had been moved from its quiet alcove to the center of the family room, where Myung-suk could use grief as a throne. Portrait-size packing material waited near the fireplace. The memorial was still 7 days away. The early preparations meant Myung-suk intended to finish the portrait before anyone outside her control could inspect it. Ireti and Jae-hwan entered the linen passage through a panel behind the laundry cabinets. The space was barely wide enough for their shoulders. Old pipes crossed above them. At each junction, Jae-hwan moved ahead to test the floor, then stepped aside so Ireti could choose the route. The man who once issued commands with a glance now followed the woman who understood the building through the movement of cloth and air. They reached the conservation room and found it empty. The humidity tag still pulsed from above. Ireti placed her palm against the ceiling. A faint vibration traveled through the plaster. The portrait was moving inside the old fabric lift. They ran. The dressing room door opened just as the lift reached the upper floor. 2 foundation workers pushed out the humidity case. Myung-suk's conservator followed with a palette of warm gray paint. He had already covered Yetunde's exposed brow and one cheek. Only the eye Ireti first discovered remained visible through the fresh layer. Jae-hwan stepped into the corridor. The workers froze. Their hands left the case. The conservator clutched his palette but could not hold Jae-hwan's gaze. He placed it on the floor and backed away. Ireti crossed to the canvas. The new paint was still soft. She touched none of it until she had checked the older layer beneath. Myung-suk had ordered a rushed erasure, but the conservator had laid down a temporary isolating coat first. Whether from ethics or fear, he had left the hidden face recoverable. Ireti looked toward him. He gave the smallest bow, then followed the workers down the corridor. The portrait entered Hae-won's dressing room for the first time in 18 years. Her clothes remained inside cedar cabinets. A row of unfinished jackets hung by the window, half Korean in structure and half Nigerian in cloth. Jae-hwan touched the shoulder of one and closed his eyes for a single breath. He had inherited his mother's enemies, her properties, and the myth built around her death. He had inherited almost nothing that showed how she lived. Ireti set the portrait beneath a lamp and began removing the wet gray layer. Jae-hwan held the suction hose as she worked. The hidden eye cleared first, then the scar near Yetunde's ear. Under the rushed paint, another section of original color had loosened along Hae-won's hand. Ireti secured it, removed the old gray screen, and exposed the fingers beneath. Hae-won was not merely holding Yetunde's wrist. She was fastening her own half of the brass cuff to it. The painted cuff was complete, joined around both women's hands. Hae-won's fingers rested on one side of the fracture. Yetunde's thumb covered the other. The portrait had been commissioned at the moment they chose to share the risk of changing the Kwon business. Their partnership had not been symbolic. Hae-won had placed the family's mark between them, transforming an emblem of control into a promise of equal responsibility. Jae-hwan looked at the completed cuff in Ireti's open case. Then he looked at the ring he no longer wore. His mother had tried to turn inherited power into shared duty. Myung-suk had killed her before the change could become public. 18 years later, Her son had surrendered a port concession to protect Yetunde's workers without knowing he was repeating Hae-won's last decision. The truth did not rescue him from his family. It made his remaining choices harder. If he revealed the portrait, the organization would fracture. Men held together by fear would compete for roots, debts, and loyalties. If he kept it hidden, Myung-suk would maintain order, and Hae-won would remain alone on the wall, while Yetunde carried the cost in silence. Jae-hwan could protect the city from an immediate power struggle or protect the truth his mother died trying to leave behind. He could no longer pretend those were the same act. Ireti finished clearing Yetunde's mouth. No smile appeared. Both women looked directly toward the viewer, calm and unsheltered. The portrait was not sentimental. It was a declaration made by two people who understood exactly who would object. Jae-hwan lowered the suction hose. A streak of gray paint crossed Ireti's cheek where her glove had brushed her skin. He wet a clean cotton pad and lifted his hand, then waited. Ireti could have stepped back. Instead, she turned her face toward him. He removed the paint without touching the unmarked skin around it. His care was clumsy compared with hers, but his hand remained steady. When the gray disappeared, Ireti took the cotton pad from him and cleaned a line of dust from his jaw. The room narrowed to the distance between their breaths. They had crossed Seoul and an ocean because their mother's truth had made separation impossible. Desire did not arrive as rescue. It arrived as recognition. She saw the son beneath the boss. He saw the woman whose skill had become courage long before he entered her life. Ireti rested her forehead against his. Jae-hwan closed the remaining distance. The kiss was brief, quiet, and chosen with the same care she used before touching damaged paint. Neither reached for more. The portrait stood beside them, its recovered faces refusing secrecy. Whatever came next would have to survive in that light. The security lamps outside the dressing room flickered. Jae-hwan moved away first. His phone showed every entrance still locked, yet the Eastern cameras had begun failing in the same sequence as the night of the smoke attack. 1, 2, 3. The system recognized an authorized master key. Only 2 people had ever held one. Hae-won was dead. The last light above the portrait went out. "Cover that face, Ireti," Jae-hwan said as the mansion went dark. "My mother's killer has just entered the house." Ireti dropped the protective cloth over the canvas. In the blackout, the hidden face vanished again, but this time by her own hand and for the purpose of survival. Jae-hwan pushed the humidity case against the dressing room doors. Footsteps approached through the corridor with no hurry at all. Myung-suk's cane struck the marble once. The sound carried through the cedar cabinets. A second strike followed. Locks released across the east wing. She was not entering as an intruder. She was reminding the house who still controlled it. Ireti switched on her ultraviolet torch and covered its lens with blue filter cloth. The narrow violet beam made her numbered conservation tape glow along the frame. It also revealed footprints on the polished floor where fresh resin from the foundation workshop had transferred from a shoe. The trail did not lead from the main corridor. It ended at the mirror beside Hae-won's wardrobe. Jae-hwan pulled the mirror forward. Behind it waited the upper door of the old fabric lift. Myung-suk had already sent someone into the room. A shadow moved between the hanging jackets. Ireti swung the lamp. The foundation conservator stepped out, one hand gripping a bottle of fast-setting black varnish. Shame bent his shoulders, but fear pushed him toward the portrait. Jae-hwan moved to intercept him. Ireti reached the canvas first and kicked the bottle from his hand. It struck the floor, coating the boards in a dark reflective sheet. The conservator slipped. Jae-hwan caught him by the collar before his head met the cutting table. For one suspended second, he held the man who had twice helped erase Yetunde's face. Then he lowered him safely and pushed him toward the open lift. Mercy did not clear the man's guilt. It denied Myung-suk the chaos she expected. The cane struck the corridor a third time. The dressing room doors shuddered beneath pressure. Ireti folded the portrait into its travel case while Jae-hwan unlocked the lift brake. The old platform had been built for bolts of fabric, not people. Its cables groaned as they lowered the painting onto it. The doors burst inward before they could descend. Myung-suk entered with 4 men in dark coats. She wore white mourning silk over black clothes. In one hand, she carried Hae-won's silver medicine case. In the other, she held the jade ring Yetunde had used to reconstruct the cup exchange. She must have searched the Lagos house through the same people who sealed the workshop. Yet Yetunde had sent the real evidence to Seoul before they arrived. Myung-suk placed the medicine case on one side of the floor and the black council ring that conferred control of the organization on the other. Between them stood Jae-hwan. The choice was arranged with ceremonial clarity. He could take the ring, preserve the organization, and allow the portrait to disappear, or he could keep protecting the evidence and inherit the disorder that followed. Jae-hwan bent toward the floor. Myung-suk's shoulders eased. He picked up the medicine case. The men moved. Ireti released the counterweight on the fabric rack. 30 bolts of silk rolled from their rails and dropped between the doorway and the lift. Color flooded the dark room. White, crimson, gold, and indigo cloth unfurled across the floor, wrapping ankles and blocking sight without harming anyone. Jae-hwan pushed the portrait platform downward. Ireti stepped onto it after the case. He remained above. She caught his wrist before the platform could fall. He tried to free her hand, pointing toward the controls below. Ireti tightened her grip. She had not crossed an ocean to become the reason he sacrificed himself in a locked room. With her free hand, she looped the joined brass cuff over his fingers. Jae-hwan looked at the cuff, linking them across the narrowing gap. Then he stepped onto the platform. The lift descended as Myung-suk reached the opening. Her cane struck the metal door, but the old platform had already dropped beyond her hand. Above them, the men cut through the fallen silk. Below, the shaft ended at the linen passage, with no clear route for the portrait's wide case. Ireti measured the frame against the opening. It would not pass upright. Tilting it risked pressure against the freshly exposed paint. Behind them, the lift cable began moving upward. Myung-suk was recalling the platform. Jae-hwan braced the case while Ireti removed its rigid upper shell. She slid acid-free boards across both faces of the canvas, wrapped the assembly in rami from the disguised roll, and released the frame from 2 lower brackets. The method violated every comfortable rule of museum transport. It also reduced the width by 6 centimeters. The bundle passed through the hatch. Jae-hwan followed, pulling the lower edge as Ireti guided the painted surface. The lift rose behind his heels. Its platform caught his coat and dragged the fabric upward. He tore free, leaving half the coat in the shaft, and dropped into the passage beside her. They carried the portrait between them. At the next junction, water rushed along the floor. Myung-suk had activated the old fire system, not to extinguish flames, but to flood the linen route. The bottom board darkened. Ireti raised her end onto her shoulder. Jae-hwan lifted until the bundle cleared the water completely. Their escape became a moving balance. When his footing failed, she took more weight. When the low pipes threatened the canvas, he bent beneath them first and guided her through. No one rescued the other. Each prevented the other from falling. They reached the laundry room as security shutters began closing across the house. The older cook had left one service door wedged open with the tray of persimmons. Jae-hwan carried the portrait through. Ireti pulled the tray free an instant before the shutter struck the floor. Outside, 2 cars waited. One belonged to Myung-suk. The other was the unmarked delivery van. Its driver had vanished. Ireti took the keys from beneath the tire where she had hidden them earlier. Jae-hwan secured the painting and entered the passenger side. They drove through the service gate while black vehicles turned across the main courtyard. Seoul, at 3 in the morning, became a corridor of wet light. Cars followed them across the river. Jae-hwan could have summoned armed support from the fragments of his organization still loyal to him. Instead, he directed Ireti toward the all-night flower market, where delivery trucks, workers, and street cameras made an attack impossible to hide. They entered among vans carrying chrysanthemums for Hae-won's memorial. Myung-suk's cars slowed. Public visibility accomplished what weapons could not. For the second time that night, being seen kept the truth alive. At a rented restoration lab near the market, Ireti opened the travel bundle. Water had reached the lower corner. One strip of original ground had lifted near Yetunde's blue wrapper, and the fresh retouching on her cheek had blurred. The face remained. The joined hands remained. The damage could be stabilized, but not before the morning press saw the images Myung-suk had already released. Every major Korean news feed carried photographs of Ireti removing paint from the portrait. The sequence had been cut to make the hidden face appear new. Foundation experts described the discovery as an unauthorized invention by a foreign restorer. Clients began withdrawing works from Ireti's Seoul studio. A professional board suspended her pending inquiry. Her years of work collapsed across a screen in less than an hour. Jae-hwan watched the cancellations appear. His thumb hovered over the private contact list that could silence editors and frighten witnesses. Ireti took the phone from him. She deleted nothing. A reputation cleared through intimidation would remain another kind of prison. She placed the phone beside the portrait and resumed consolidating the lifted paint. Jae-hwan opened his laptop. He gathered the Kwon organization's port accounts, shell company routes, security contracts, and records of the foundation's false conservation work. The files implicated Myung-suk. They also implicated him. He had inherited systems he tried to restrain but had still used them, still benefited from their silence, and still allowed fear to perform work in his name. He sent the complete archive to prosecutors and 3 independent newspapers. The upload bar crossed the screen. With every percentage, a piece of his empire left his control. At 100, he closed the laptop and placed both palms flat on the table. His future no longer belonged to the organization. It belonged to whatever consequences entered after daylight. Ireti reached across the portrait and covered one of his hands with hers. Outside, a taxi stopped beside the flower market. Yetunde stepped onto the pavement carrying Hae-won's unfinished indigo and Rami coat over one arm. Behind her came 6 women from the Lagos Cooperative, each holding a sealed cutting pattern and a matching brass fastener from the collection Myung-suk claimed had never existed. Yetunde had spent 18 years protecting her daughter by remaining unseen. Now she had come to stand beside her face. Yetunde entered the restoration lab without embracing her daughter. She went first to the portrait. Her fingers stopped above Hae-won's painted hand, respecting the boundary Ireti had taught her long ago. The real brass cuff circled Yetunde's wrist. Ireti had fastened it there when her mother entered the lab. Beneath Seoul's fluorescent light, the metal matched the cuff, joining the 2 women on the canvas. Age had darkened both in the same places. Ireti waited for her mother to look away. Yetunde did not. She removed the unfinished indigo and Rami coat from its cover and dressed a mannequin beside the easel. The 6 women from Lagos unfolded cutting patterns across an empty table. Each pattern carried matching chalk corrections in Hae-won's Korean notation and Yetunde's curved drafting marks. The brass fasteners fitted the empty loops in the garments from Iljiro. The collection formed a physical chain from the atelier to Lagos, made years before Ireti ever touched the portrait. Myung-suk could accuse one black restorer of inventing a face. She could not easily explain an entire abandoned collection, 2 sets of tools, 6 surviving prototypes, and the living woman whose scar, cuff, and clothing matched the original paint. Yet authenticity alone would not win the morning. Myung-suk had moved the family council forward. Before prosecutors could secure the foundation offices, the Kwon elders would gather at sunrise in the ancestral house. If they confirmed her as emergency chair, she could scatter records, redirect loyalists, and frame Jae-hwan's disclosure as the act of an unstable heir influenced by a foreign fraud. 3 hours remained. The portrait could not survive transport in its current state. Ireti sat beneath the lamp. Yetunde tied back her daughter's hair with the red cotton thread from the first package. It was a familiar motion from Ireti's childhood, but this time her mother's hands did not try to turn her towards safety. They prepared her to finish. Together, they stabilized the water-damaged corner. Ireti injected conservation adhesive beneath the lifting ground with a fine syringe. Yetunde warmed small sandbags and passed them into her hands. The Lagos women cut rami strips for temporary edge lining. Jae-hwan worked at the far table, sorting evidence by date and source for the investigators already moving through the city. No one performed a miracle. The damage remained visible beneath close inspection. The gray erasure could not be removed from every fiber before sunrise. Ireti made a choice that changed the meaning of the restoration. She left one narrow band of gray beside Yetunde's shoulder. It was not unfinished work, it was evidence. If she removed every trace, the finished portrait might suggest the erasure had never happened. The surviving strip showed where a human being had been converted into background. Future viewers would see both the recovered woman and the attempt to hide her. Yetunde studied the band. Her thumb rubbed the brass cuff, then she nodded once. She unfastened it and placed it beside Ireti's repaired glove. The daughter would not return her mother to innocence. She would return her to the truth. Across the room, Jae-hwan printed the final page of his disclosure. A car waited to take him to the prosecutors after the council. He removed his watch, phone, and wallet and sealed them inside a clear evidence bag. Ireti saw the deliberate preparation. He was not planning to escape the consequences of the organization he had led. She crossed to him and took the bag. For a moment, he resisted. His eyes moved toward the portrait, then toward the door, arranging a future in which he left before his presence could damage her further. Ireti placed the bag back in his hands and closed his fingers around it. She was not asking him to run. She was making it clear that surrender did not require disappearing from her life. Jae-hwan lifted her restored glove from the table. The red seam he had first tried to mend ran across its wrist. He slid it gently over her hand, then pressed the completed brass cuff above it. The metal joined their mother's story to the work still ahead. They left for the ancestral house at dawn. The property stood north of Seoul behind a wall of dark tile and old pine. Cameras crowded the road. Myung-suk's accusations had drawn reporters who expected a spectacle involving a Mafia heir, a foreign restorer, and a portrait altered in secret. Jae-hwan's released files had added police vehicles and financial investigators to the gathering. Ireti stepped from the van first. She wore a simple black dress beneath Hae-won's unfinished Rami jacket. Yetunde had completed its missing sleeve during the flight from Lagos using a panel of indigo cloth. The design did not disguise one culture inside the other. Both remained visible in the seams. Jae-hwan came after her without guards. He carried the portrait with two of Yetunde's cooperative members. A man once followed by convoys now took equal weight at the back of a wooden transport frame. Inside, the memorial table had been arranged with rice, soup, fruit, rice cakes, and Hae-won's favorite dried persimmons. Myung-suk sat at the head of the room in white mourning silk. The jade ring rested on her finger. Around her, elders wore the small silver pins of the Kwon Council. An empty place waited for Jae-hwan on her right, close enough to imply reconciliation if he accepted it. He walked past the chair. Ireti directed the portrait to the center of the room. Myung-suk raised one hand. Household staff moved toward the frame, but the older cook from the mansion entered behind it. She placed her broken access card on the memorial table. Beside it, She laid a conservation journal open to Ireti's photograph and surname, along with a tissue envelope holding a second curl of the old gray paint. She had scraped the first sample from the portrait after Yetunde was erased, sent it to Lagos, and later recommended Ireti when smoke damage finally forced the family to seek an outside restorer. The discovery had not been coincidence. It had been the last careful act of a woman who served Hae-won and could not challenge Myung-suk openly. The guard from Il Giro followed and added her card. Then the foundation conservator set down the palette used to cover Yetunde's face. 3 people who had served the Kwon family chose evidence over obedience. The room shifted. Elders who had avoided Ireti's eyes now studied Myung-suk. No one had yet seen the full portrait. Its protective cloth still covered both women. Yetunde approached Hae-won's ancestral tablet. She bowed with the restrained dignity of a guest honoring a Korean home, then placed Hae-won's silver thimble beside the dried persimmons. From her bag, she removed the surviving porcelain cup. Its green crescent faced upward. Myung-suk's hand closed over her jade ring. The movement was instinctive. Cameras at the open doors caught it. So did Jae-hwan. He placed Hae-won's silver medicine case beside the cup. The jade ring had made the same curved scrape across both objects 18 years earlier. An independent laboratory would later confirm old traces of the medicine Yetunde demonstrated in Lagos. At that moment, the family needed no technical explanation. They saw the witness, the cup, the ring, and the years Myung-suk had spent removing the witness from their sight. Myung-suk stood. She reached for Hae-won's tablet as if ancestral authority could still be carried away. Jae-hwan moved it beyond her hand. He did not take the head chair. He placed the tablet between Yetunde and the covered portrait. Then he stepped back beside Ireti. Ireti pulled the cloth away. Morning light reached the canvas from the courtyard. Hae-won appeared first in ivory, composed and direct. Beside her stood Yetunde in indigo and Remi, equally tall, equally central. Their hands met around the repaired brass cuff. The narrow gray band remained near Yetunde's shoulder, like a door that had failed to close. The portrait changed the balance of the room before any investigator entered. It showed that the Kwon matriarch had not stood alone. It exposed the lie beneath Myung-suk's authority. More painfully, it revealed how willingly the family had accepted a story that made a foreign black woman disposable. One elder removed his council pin and placed it on the floor. Another followed. Soon a line of silver lay between Myung-suk and the memorial table. They did not offer the pins to Jae-hwan. His disclosed records had made returning to the old order impossible. They simply refused to let his aunt continue speaking for Hae-won. Myung-suk looked at her sister's recovered face. The control in her posture finally broke. Her shoulders lowered. One hand reached toward the gray strip, perhaps to cover Yetunde again, perhaps to touch the evidence of what she had done. Ireti stepped into the space before her fingers arrived. This time, Jae-hwan did not need to move a chair or summon guards. He stood at Ireti's side. Yetunde stood at the other. Myung-suk faced the 3 people her choices had joined against her. Investigators entered through the courtyard. The foundation conservator handed them his access records. The older cook indicated the medicine case. Jae-hwan offered the clear evidence bag containing his own devices. When restraints appeared, he extended his hands as readily as his aunt was forced to extend hers. Ireti's fingers tightened around the brass cuff. Jae-hwan did not ask her to wait. He did not make a promise he could not control. He bowed first to his mother's portrait, then to Yetunde, and finally to Ireti. His gaze remained on her when he turned toward the waiting car. Ireti followed as far as the gate. Before he entered, she removed the repaired glove and placed it in his open palm. The red seam crossed his skin like a small, living line. He closed his hand around it. Then the car carried him away without an escort of his own. The weeks that followed did not behave like the ending of a romance. They behaved like consequence. The Kwon organization splintered, but the public release of its roots allowed authorities to close the most dangerous channels before rival groups could claim them. Legitimate workers kept their jobs under court supervision. The family foundation lost control of its conservation program. Myung-suk's title disappeared from buildings, reports, and invitations with the same efficiency she had once used to remove Yetunde. Independent laboratories examined the portrait. They dated the original flesh tones, the first gray layer and the later resin. Imaging showed Yetunde's figure beneath the overpaint across every disputed section. The professional board restored Ireti's standing and published its apology without fanfare. Clients returned. She accepted only those who had not publicly condemned her before the evidence was tested. Yet she refused the Kwon family's offer to purchase her silence through a permanent appointment. The portrait had taught her what happened when private power controlled who could be visible. She completed the conservation under independent oversight and billed the family at her normal rate. Yetunde remained in Seoul for 3 months. She and the surviving designers finished the collection she had begun with Hae-won, but they did not recreate the past. Young Korean pattern cutters worked beside Nigerian textile artists on clothes meant for ordinary modern lives. Seoul Raimi met Lagos Indigo in jackets, work shirts, and dresses that could be worn on trains, at offices, and around family tables. Hae-won's atelier became a working place again, not a shrine. Jae-hwan spent those months under investigation. The records showed crimes committed under his authority and others he had quietly prevented. His cooperation did not erase responsibility. It changed the court's measure of it. He surrendered control of the shipping company, forfeited assets tied to the organization, and accepted strict supervision while the legitimate business was rebuilt by an independent board. Ireti visited every week. She never carried the portrait into those meetings. She brought ordinary things instead. A container of Yetunde's jollof rice, persimmon tea from the older cook. Once, the glove with the red seam, newly washed and folded. Jae-hwan returned it each time with one more careful stitch added beside his first uneven repair. Their love grew without the machinery of his former power. There were no closed restaurants, no armed drivers, and no mansion rooms waiting to impress her. There were plastic chairs beneath harsh lights, timed visits, and the long discipline of facing what could not be restored to innocence. Ireti did not mistake accountability for romance. She loved him because he continued choosing it when there was nothing left to gain. When his travel restrictions ended 14 months later, Jae-hwan did not ask Ireti to remain in Seoul. He arrived at her family home in Lagos, carrying one suitcase and Hae-won's old sewing shears. He wore a light linen suit with an indigo strip sewn inside the collar. No security vehicle followed him. At the doorway, he removed his shoes, greeted Yetunde's elder brother first, and waited for the low stool he had chosen on his first visit. Yetunde gave him the head chair. He moved it beside Ireti before sitting. That was how both families understood the decision. Not as a man absorbing a woman into his house, and not as a woman abandoning her work to repair him. They chose a life with 2 cities, 2 families, and no hidden rooms. Ireti kept her Seoul studio and opened a Lagos conservation lab for contemporary collectors. Jae-hwan built a small compliance firm that helped independent exporters move goods without paying the secret taxes his old network had imposed. He traveled under his own name and carried his own bags. They did not turn their commitment into a performance for the cameras that had once hunted them. Their ceremony was small, held in Yetunde's courtyard beneath strings of warm lights. Korean silk rested beside Yoruba aso oke. Elders from both families shared the front row. The older cook placed dried persimmons near the cake, and the Lagos cooperative women laughed when Jae-hwan's first attempt at a formal Yoruba greeting nearly sent him off balance. No portrait stood behind them. Ireti would not let the dead become decoration for a choice the living had to make themselves. 1 year after that ceremony, Hae-won's portrait returned to the El Giro atelier. Ireti mounted it behind low reflection glass on the wall between the two original cutting tables. Yetunde's face remained fully visible. The thin gray strip remained visible too. Beneath the frame, the joined brass cuff rested beside a spool of red cotton thread. Jae-hwan entered carrying 2 cups of tea. He placed one near Ireti's hand and waited while she inspected the final varnish. She leaned back at last. Their shoulders touched. In the glass, the painted women stood behind them, one in ivory and one in indigo. The light shifted. Ireti's reflection appeared beside Jae-hwan's, clear and level between their mothers' faces. He reached for her hand. She turned it upward and joined her fingers with his. 4 faces remained in the frame as evening settled over Seoul. This time, no one had to disappear for love to be seen.